Hello, my name is Matt Miller, from Essex County Council's Sustainable Growth Team. Welcome back to our Great Start series today. Today we're going to be talking about sustainability terms. I'm really happy to have Sam Candy from Responsible Futures with us today again. Hi Sam.
Hi, good to be here again.
Sam, what are we going to be going through today?
Greenhouse gas, carbon emissions and carbon footprint, scope 1, 2 and 3, net zero, carbon neutrality, offsetting and ESG.
Thank you. So first things first, I think we're going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions.
But greenhouse gas emissions are gases that are released into the Earth's atmosphere, and they contribute to the greenhouse gas effect. So it traps the heat and causes the Earth's temperature to rise. These gases include carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N20, fluorinated gases and water vapour. Human activities such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, agriculture and industrial processes are the primary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Rising levels of these gases in the atmosphere are a major contributor to global climate change. We often describe all the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's where you see the CO2e. It's a common unit to use to express the total amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted. And regardless of their specific type, based on the global warming potential relative to carbon dioxide over a specified time frame, usually it's 100 years. By converting the emissions of different gases into CO2e, it allows us to standardize a way to compare and aggregate emissions from various sources.
So that's helpful. So essentially we've got things like methane have a strong greenhouse effect, but to try and make it easy for everyone, if it's always CO2 and the equivalent, then everyone can just use that as the sort of level rather than having to know what methane would do or nitrous oxide or any of those others. Great, that's brilliant. Yeah. So now I think we move on to carbon emissions and carbon footprint. Hopefully these are terms that everybody knows, but let's dig into those a little bit.
A carbon measurement is the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are produced directly or indirectly by an individual, by an organisation, by a product or by an event. And that CO2e includes all emissions from the consumption of energy, transportation, food and any other goods and services. The larger the carbon footprint, the greater the impact on the environment and on climate change. It's a measurement of the impact that human activities have on the environment. So it's typically measured in terms of the amount of land, water and other natural resources that are used, as well as the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted. An environmental footprint can be calculated for a single product, for a person's lifestyle or for an entire country and for a business. So to get to net zero, we all need people and businesses to reduce their emissions by 90% by 2050, with the remaining 10% which can be offset. Most businesses are measuring their emissions using scope 1, 2 and 3.
For everyone watching, in this series we've got a carbon footprint calculator that's going to be coming along. That's going to be accessible at the same place where all of the content here is available, so you'll be able to download and get access to that. So you talked about scope 1, 2 and 3. Let's get into that.
So scope 1 are direct emissions that occur from sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting entity. So an example includes emissions from fuel combustion in owned or controlled boilers, furnaces, vehicles, and emissions from chemical reactions in manufacturing processes. Scope 2, these are indirect emissions associated with the consumption of purchased or acquired electricity, steam, heating or cooling by the reporting entity. And then scope 3, these are other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of the reporting entity, including both upstream and downstream emissions. So this includes emissions from sources such as business travel, employee commuting, transportation and distribution, use of sold products, waste generated in operations, and other activities that are not categorised under scope 1 or 2.
You can see why scope 3 is the hardest there then, Sam. Sorry to interrupt. They seem really tricky to be able to understand, but I think you really helped in terms of where they exist.
It is difficult, and you have to look at your supply chain. So you have to look at all your suppliers. Sometimes they won't give you that information quite easily because they might not have measured it. And actually what we're seeing is a lot of larger companies are asking their suppliers, so they've gone to all of their supply chain and said, if you don't provide a carbon reduction plan or a net zero plan, then we won't do business with you. And I've seen a lot of smaller businesses that, like, we've got a really big contract. One of our major contracts is with these companies. We've never measured our emissions. We don't know where to start. And that's exactly what this is all about, helping those businesses that if one of those large companies said to them, okay, we need your scope 1, 2 and 3, and we need you to tell us how you're going to be reducing your emissions, hopefully that's going to help these people to do this. So just really simply, scope 1, direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2, indirect emissions from purchased electricity, heat or steam. And then scope 3, indirect emissions from sources not owned or controlled by the reporting entity, including the supply chain.
So after scope 1, 2, 3, we talk about net zero and carbon neutral.
Net zero refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases emissions produced and the amount removed from the atmosphere. So in simple terms, it means the total emissions generated are equal to the total emissions removed and then finally offset. Carbon neutrality, similar to net zero, but specifically focuses on CO2 emissions that can be achieved through renewable energy sources or planting trees or investing in carbon offset projects.
So you talk about offsetting. Tell us a bit more about that, please, Sam.
Offsetting refers to a variety of actions that aim to counterbalance or neutralise negative impacts on the environment. So this includes things like planting trees, investing in renewable energy, or capturing, storing carbon dioxide from power plants. Then you have water offsetting. So this involves taking actions to conserve or protect water resources in order to compensate for water used in activities such as agriculture, farming or manufacturing, implementing water efficient irrigation practices or protecting natural water sources. Then you have habitat offsetting. So this is where you take action to protect or restore habitats in order to compensate for habitat loss. So some examples are creating protected areas, restoring degraded habitats, or implementing land use policies that prioritise the protection of natural areas. You have biodiversity offsetting. So this involves taking actions to protect or restore biodiversity in order to compensate for negative impacts on species or ecosystems. So examples here are creating protected areas, implementing conservation programs. And this is actually a new EU regulation. So the use of commonplace environmental terms like environmentally friendly, eco, natural, biodegradable, and similar descriptions on products such as clothing and cosmetics and food now requires supporting evidence. Some sustainable labels, they must adhere to certain certification schemes. Claims like 30% less emissions must be backed by tangible targets. You've got to be able to prove it. You cannot use claims relying on emission offsetting schemes. So expressions like you might have seen carbon neutral flights or plastic bottles or foods that suggest carbon neutrality through tree planting are now banned. This means that you can no longer promote carbon neutral products with the incentive to buy carbon credits. As I say, this is just in the EU at the moment.
Great, thanks, Sam. So we've got one more to go before we finish that, and that's ESG.
The E stands for environmental. The S stands for social. So this is health and safety, working conditions, diversity, equity and inclusion, human rights, employee relations, training and education. And then you've got the G, which stands for governance. So that's your board diversity and structure, risk management, your tax strategy. ESG is a multiple set of standards, GRI, Global Reporting Initiatives, SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and they measure a company's environmental, social and governance criteria. It assesses its impact on the environment, on societal contributions and governance structure to evaluate its overall responsibility and long-term viability. But ESG criteria, it's really used a lot by investors and analysts and stakeholders to assess these practices. These kind of things are being looked at. Thanks again, Sam. Really great. Do you know what we've got coming up next? So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to sustainability strategy next. We've talked about that ESG. How do you put that into a strategy? Where do you start? Let's go through some steps. Fantastic. Thank you again. Thanks. Thank you.